Welcome back. Now, the National Assembly, that's the Nigerian Parliament, has passed a budget of 13.588 trillion naira for the year 2021. The revised fiscal document is 505 billion naira more than the 13 trillion which was initially proposed by President Muhammadu Buhari back in October. According to the chairman, Senate Committee on Appropriation, Barau Jibrin, the increment was necessitated by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the country's economy, a request by the executive to upscale the national social investment program, and an under projection of total revenue. However, key budget parameters were retained. Oil benchmark was left at $40 per barrel with a projected daily oil production rate of 1.86 million barrels per day. Now, that includes condensate. Exchange rate was also left at $379 naira now to the dollar, while GDP projection is 3% and inflation rate 11.5%. Now, capital expenditure was jacked up from 3.6 trillion to 4.1 trillion, while recurrent stands at 5.6 trillion. With aggregate revenue available to fund the budget projected at 7.89 trillion, it means Nigeria would still rely on huge borrowing to fund the budget. All right, joining me now to discuss the budget further is Professor Ken Ife, who is an economist, a macroeconomist, as a matter of fact. Professor, thank you very much for joining us on the program. The National Assembly increased the budget by 500 billion naira. So we have a budget of 13.588 trillion. The question is, you look at the revenue side, do you think it's something that would be able to meet?
Well, obviously the devil is in the details in terms of how Europe plays out. It's not something that we can say is cast iron guarantee, because you see what happened this year. We had the COVID, it came in around March and decimated the budget and all the revenue projections, but there were recoveries here and there. So, you just have to see how that goes. But I think the best efforts seem to suggest that that is realizable. If you look at the breakdown of the Federation revenue, and then also the inclusion of the government-owned enterprises, which will bring in about 1.348 trillion. You know that about 20 enterprises are brought into the budget.
But that is where the problem is. You look at these government enterprises, you talk about customs, for instance. Now we're beginning to see a second wave of the virus. We're beginning to see lockdowns across the world. Do you think these government enterprises, take for instance customs, you think customs will be able to raise enough revenue, considering that trade is likely to remain dull even in the first and second quarter of next year, because we do not know, it definitely will take some time before the vaccine actually take root?
Well, the experience of the first lockdown in April, May, has shown everybody that we have to tread with caution in any subsequent lockdown. So you have to be selective, it has to be targeted, it should not disrupt trade. If you look at transportation, in the second quarter, the transport sector collapsed completely to minus 47%. Then even the aviation was even worse, plus extra 10% in the negative territory. Even in the third quarter, aviation was still around 30-something, minus 30-something%, and the transport sector around. So we're going to be a long way to recover from what happened to the transportation sector.
Absolutely.
So we don't want to go there. Instead, we focus on the people, ensure that the gatherings are reduced, that the masks and social distancing and all those procedures are observed while waiting to see what vaccine can come. So we are keeping away. Like the flights now, the flights are jam-packed, heavy. If you look at all the airports are fully, there's no, you can't drop any pin in the airports. Because people want to go home.
So, Prof, let's talk about the revenue. I mean, projected revenue is 7.8 billion, or trillion, I should say. And clearly we're going to borrow to make up for the deficit. And for quite a while now, people like you have been harping on the issue of not just the budget deficit, but, the cost of servicing our debt. So our debt profile is definitely going to go up. You look at what is budgeted for debt servicing, quite high, almost like a third of the budget. And now we're going to borrow more to fund this budget. What do you have concerns there?
There's always an ongoing concern on the borrowing, but not from the point of view of the possibility that we have we've overstretched on borrowing. It's not the borrowing crisis that we have. It's the revenue crisis that we have.
Absolutely.
Or lack of liquidity to be able to service the loan. But of course, there are two issues around this. One, do we need to borrow? Of course, the answer is yes, because we need to build infrastructure. There are certain projects that we need to borrow to make sure that borrowing is a leverage if the costs of borrowing are very reasonable. And in this case, they are all concessionary rates. And in any case, we actually found a better way of borrowing from domestic at less than 1%, as you find out now with the treasury bills now running well below 1%. So that is good news, actually. But then it still doesn't remove the issue of you must be borrowing responsibly for the projects that are capable of retiring the loan.
Absolutely.
So in other words, those have to be sustainable. But part of the ongoing challenge is the debt service to government revenue, which is about 40%. It actually came down from over about 60 to 50 down to 40, just a little over 40 now. But having said that, it's still significant.
Yeah, quite significant.
And we know many reasons for this, because our tax to GDP ratio is very low. It's the lowest at about 6-7%. The average is 18%. And the ECOWAS macroeconomic convergence criteria for member states to accede to a single currency requires 20% revenue to GDP. So we're so far away with a factor of 3 in terms of raising revenue. So that's where our Achilles heel. But there are a few things, though. If you look at this current budget, you see that there's financing from privatization, which could bring in about 205
and
billion.
Let's talk about that privatization, because we do not know how that is going to go. And we know, for instance, that some of these assets that we want to privatize are actually bogged down in controversy. The other day, we saw the National Assembly coming out to say they've not been carried along. The unions are opposed to the privatizing, to the privatization of some of these assets. Is that not going to be a challenge?
Well, these challenges are ongoing, but there are several things that the union need to understand. The case has to be made clearer to the union by communication, by a strong advocacy, and they need to understand that some of the concessioning schemes are important for our economy to go forward. And the unions, much as we respect the unions and labor must be part of the equation and they must be carried along, but they also need to know that they are just one part of the equation. This country expends 70% of the revenue of this country just to service less than 3% of the population that are employed workforce. And we need to understand that we have to run a country. So that case has to be sold to them in a fully consultative manner. And they need to understand that their interest shouldn't take precedence over the interest of the entire country. So where we have borrowed huge sums to build infrastructure, and then the issue now is how do you concession that infrastructure so that it can actually repay the money?
Pay the money.
And then the union is going to say, no, you can't. No, that is not a business model that we can find justification for. So we have to go around this in the appropriate way.
And let's talk about the recurrent side of the budget. It's still on the high side. I mean, good enough that the lawmakers were able to push up the capital side of the budget now to over 4 trillion. But you look at the recurrent, it's still on the high side. What exactly can we do to bring down the recurrent budget, and so that we're able to build up our capital budget, and then that way we're able to, execute some of this infrastructure that you've actually talked about?
Look, the capital budget is actually an improvement last year, remember, it was around 25%.
Yes.
Now it's over 30%. And then, in fact, there's a double approach to the thing. First of all, we are getting about 1 trillion. If we were to stop today on 2020 budget, there would have been 1 trillion left to be spent on capital project. So the assembly says continue to spend till March, which means the capital will gain about 1 extra trillion, and then run concurrently with the implementation of the first quarter of the 2021 budget. So that's a double win for the capital expenditure, quite apart from the fact that it's now over 30%, which is very, very ideal, which is where we are aiming at. In the case of the recurrent expenditure, there have been so many schemes intending to rationalize government exposure to, what do you call it, Orosanyon's report that sought to rationalize some of these MDAs, and there are quite a lot of them. And some of them were recommended to be closed, to be merged, and all of that, to bring some efficiency scrutiny to that sector, to those sectors. So that's work in progress. There have also been cries for minimizing waste, and there's a lot of waste in our bureaucracy, in our system. And then there are also other people wanting the likes of the National Assembly to trim their budgets and stuff like that. But they're work in progress. But I think we need to focus more on the revenue that we can generate.
Yes, I mean,
and other creative ways of dealing with the infrastructure challenge.
Absolutely.
And one of them has already been agreed.
Revenue is key here, because if we're not able to raise the revenue, it's difficult to see how we'd be able to execute some of these very beautiful projects we have actually lined up. Let's talk about the projection, the GDP projection, 3%. Don't you think that's overly optimistic?
Well, when they say 3%, it's 3% over the year. Not that you're going to arrive at 3% on the first quarter of 2021.
Yeah, of course.
First quarter of 2021, with the best luck, is we will be getting to zero. In other words, moving back to positive territory from minus 3.10%. We have to see what this quarter gives anyway. But that is, from there, it is your finish line. Your finish line may end up to be 4% or 3.2%, but when you aggregate all of them and divide by 4, then you will get an average of 3%. So we have to see how.
Is that realistic from your own point of view?
It's not impossible. Let me tell you why. Planning is the key to our challenge. In 1975 development plan we had, that was where you had reconstruction, rehabilitation, and reconciliation. All hands were on deck, driven by a corporate plan for the country. And we returned 11.4% growth rate. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. What is important is having a good plan that synergizes all the actors, and then make sure that, you say infrastructure. I give an example. In March, when the COVID came in, a meeting was held at the central bank, and it was agreed that the private sector will float infrastructure company, and that will be capitalized with 15 trillion naira, and government will give it $3 billion sovereign guarantee. With that, they can take over all these 26 major infrastructure projects the federal government is handling, and take that burden away from federal government.
And
so
that would be fantastic.
Concentrate on other things, on how they could deal with education, sort out health, social inclusion, working with state governments on agriculture. But that is a model that is going to make a huge difference. We will now stop borrowing externally, because we are now using Naira, 15 trillion, to deal with all our projects. So that is a creative way that can move us into a quantum leap when it comes to these GDP growth rates. So it's not
absolutely. I mean, you're quite right. I can't but agree with you. The fact is that we're in a country where the government seems to be, biting more than it could chew. So it would make better sense if the private sector could come into.
And let me give you another example. very early on, the president okayed employment of 774,000 people, 1,000 per local government. The resources were made available. This was more than 6 months ago. Today, these people have not been employed. There's all politics going up and down, and we don't know when it's going to happen. It's going to be sometime next year for 3 months job. Just look at how that is, look at how that is going up and down.
It's really unfortunate.
These are some of the things. When you leave these things in the orbit of government only, it becomes a lot more difficult to achieve them. And then if you have to wait on projects, all the capital projects and the infrastructure road project, they will get the money and split it up, and then you put 2 billion here, 1 billion here, 3 billion there. It will take you 50 years to complete one good road, 10 years to complete a good. Push this thing to the private sector and let them get on with it.
Finally, Prof, before I let you go, there's something we always don't talk about in this country. The truth is that, look, this country is made up of 36 economies. And as we speak today, apart from the federal budget, we have 36 budgets. If you add that of the Federal Capital Territory, we're looking at 37 budgets. But it appears people are not concentrating on the budgets of the states, because the truth is that if the states are able to execute their budget, implement their budgets faithfully, the fact is that the country will turn around. So the federal budget alone cannot be the magic one that turns the economy around. How important is it, Prof, for states to implement their budgets faithfully to ensure that, they do things right? Because the way I see it, if the states do not do their part, it's difficult to see how things can change.
Yeah, you're right, actually, because economic development is on the concurrent legislative list. So all of them are all active players, and this is not in the exclusive list. So local government, state government, federal government, they're all active players, as well as the private sector. And half of our economy, national economy, is actually at the state level. And so we should see how we leverage their performance. Now, one thing that I can tell you, one special thing that I find in this current dispensation is that in the first term, we had what we call dysfunctional National Assembly that was delivering 7 months late, budget late every year on year. It was 6-7 months late. This time we have much more harmonious relationship between the National Assembly and the executive. And then we have a much more robust leadership from the Ministry of Finance, the Budget and National Planning. And I really admire how they have got about their business. We have a Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007 that says that both levels of government, both the federal executive and legislature, should consult effectively with all stakeholders on preparation of budget, this fiscal strategy paper, and then medium-term expenditure paper strategy, and then the final one, which is to do the appropriation. And I have seen both of them religiously implement those three, and then got everybody. So we have a fully participatory budgeting process right now. Now, and also you have a macroeconomic handshake between monetary policy and fiscal policy.
Fiscal policy, yeah.
Now, we now have the same law that they are faithfully implementing was recommended to the state governments. Only 15 states have adopted the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And even as they needed to create the institution that goes with it, which is the Fiscal Responsibility Commission, and then now make sure that what I have just described to you that is happening here at the federal does happen at the state level. So they are all, my experience, I was out training some of those states, the South, Southeast, and Southwest. My experience is that they're all at different stages, even in the implementation. Even the 15 that have signed up and domesticated the law, they're all still at different stages. There is no substitute for transparency, accountability, and prudence in fiscal matters. There's no substitute. So, how can you talk about fiscal stability when you don't have, and how even their revenue generation will benefit from fully applying these principles that are laid down in the 2007 Act.
All right.
The question, the scene is that many of them are far from it. And then, of course, they're also hostage to the debt crisis created by the COVID-19. And if you notice that at the beginning of this current administration in 2015, they had to borrow 600 billion from central bank to bail out all these states, and then hope that they will repay them in due course. Of course, Paris money came in as well. But they'll have their own challenges. But the challenge, however much challenge you have, you still need to adopt the fiscal principles that will guide you in being more efficient through broader transparency, more accountability, and then more prudence in the way you manage public resources. It is a big gap there in the states, at the state level.
All right, Prof. Thank you very much for your time. Well, the government has tagged a budget of recovery and resilience. Let's just hope and believe that this budget will help Nigeria recover from the recession and set us on the path to growth. And
I'm optimistic.
I'm optimistic as well. I'm also hoping that the states will do their part, because we really need them on board. We really need these states on board. Thank you very much, Prof, for joining us on the program, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, your insights. Thank you so very much, Prof.
Thank you very much.
All right. Merry Christmas. Well, that's how much we can take on the program this week. We thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Merry Christmas and bye-bye.